Good morning or afternoon. My name is Chris Hill and I'm an ATD data coach. It's my pleasure to introduce the next session entitled Centering Equity in Strategic Enrollment Management. I'd like to remind everyone that you can enlarge the slides on your screen by double-clicking on the slides themselves. In this session, we will review enrollment data, share a scenario planning framework that can be applied to strategic enrollment management, and discuss several scenarios that may impact enrollment and retention in the community college sector over the next several years. I'll begin the session by sharing some recent data points on enrollment, and will then introduce the presenters for each segment of the presentation. Next slide. As we all know, colleges have had to pivot over these past few months to meet the challenges of COVID-19, including shifting to remote learning and services. Add to that current and impending budget cuts and declining enrollment, and it's really been a tough year. So let's take a look at a few of those enrollment data points. Next slide. This slide shows us the percent change in enrollment from year to year over a 4-year period through spring of 2019. It's clear that even before the pandemic, 2-year public colleges were experiencing a loss of enrollment every year. With the exception of earlier years for 4-year public institutions, all other sectors saw losses as well. Next slide. Once COVID hit, there was an interest in understanding how it might affect enrollment, and the summer numbers from the National Student Clearinghouse were sobering. While 4-year public institutions saw a bit of an uptick from summer 2019 to summer 2020, 2-year public institutions saw a drop of almost 6% from the prior summer. Next. For community colleges, there were even greater drops within specific populations, including Black students, males, and part-time students. Next. A first look at fall numbers as of September 10th indicated that the trend would continue with 2-year public institutions seeing a 7.5% drop from fall 2019. 4-year public institutions stayed pretty steady initially. Next. When disaggregating, we saw drops across all ethnicities and almost all age groups. Go ahead and hit next. The one exception for students was aged 17 or younger, whose enrollment increased by 2.2% due to dual enrollment. Now, subsequent numbers have come out since then, and numbers released on September 24th showed an even greater decline in fall enrollments from the prior year, even touching the dual enrollment students who have now dropped off by about 5.5% from fall 2019. The two populations that at this point have experienced the largest decline from fall 2019 are Black and Hispanic males, whose enrollments have declined by 21% and 19% respectively. Next. So while these numbers are definitely troubling and they present a challenge to all of our institutions, it's important to remember that we are resilient and adaptive. Whether we're installing Wi-Fi hotspots in campus parking lots, donating medical supplies from our allied health programs, or stocking food pantries, there's no shortage of examples of how we have very quickly adapted to provide the instruction, the services, and support that our students as well as our communities need during this pandemic. It's this adaptive nature that we want to continue to apply moving forward. And we hope that today's presentations will help you think a bit differently about planning for future enrollment. Next. So I would like to introduce our first presenter who will appear via a recorded presentation. He's Jeffrey Buller, Senior Partner of Academic Training, Leadership, and Assessment, and he will be sharing a different way to think about planning.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to present a few ideas today at this important conference dedicated to the idea of how we can dismantle barriers and biases. And what I want to talk about today is how strategic enrollment management is changing and why it must. For more than 30 years, the primary mechanism colleges and universities have been engaging in for strategic change has been strategic planning. And that's a good thing. Strategic planning helps institutions become more intentional, less reactive about how they change. It provides a system, targets, and metrics and goals that we can use to measure whether we're being effective in how we change. Increasingly, strategic planning is being recognized as problematic. It's a fairly blunt tool. What do I mean by this? Well, I see four major problems with strategic planning. First of all, it assumes we can predict an unpredictable future. After all, that's what strategic planning is trying to do. It takes a strategic look towards the future and says, in 10 years, where should we be? Or in 20 years, where should we be? But our vision of the future becomes less clear over time. Things change. The world changes. The world of higher education changes. And so the context in which we're operating becomes very different after 3 years or 5 years. And as a result, many institutions find that their strategic plan is less effective, less on target after about 3 or 5 years. They end up implementing less of it. A lot in the first year, a good amount in the second year, but less and less as time goes on. If you think about the fact that most university strategic plans are for 10 to 25 years, they're planning for a future that looks very, very cloudy indeed. That's why my friend, the former chancellor of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Harvey Perlman, says the worst thing you can do with a strategic plan is to follow it, because the world will have changed by the time you reach that ultimate target you have in your plan. Now, the second problem I see with strategic planning is that it rarely sees below the waterline. This is borrowing from one of those iceberg metaphors that are so common. It's a model of change that was developed by the scholar and corporate professional Wilfried Kruger, who says that what we see above the waterline when we're doing strategic planning, or really any corporate or educational process, is we're looking at the time it's going to take to achieve our goals, the quality issues, the costs that it's going to incur. We do all this issue management, but the things that cause us to crash on the rocks are the things we don't expect and don't see, those messy people issues, individual goals, individual agendas, people's hidden agendas, their alliances, their cliques, their enemies. And those are the things that actually can cause a strategic plan to fail. What happens then leads us to problem number 3. Strategic planning almost inevitably leads to mission creep. It causes most institutions to try to become something they're not. The way I describe this is, if you look at most institutions' strategic plan, if they're a community college, what are they planning to become? They want to become a 4-year college. If they're a 4-year college, they want to become a university. If they're a university, they want to become a research university. And if they're a research university, they want to become a Research One university. The result is, if every strategic plan was accomplished, higher education would look more alike. We'd have more identical institutions rather than distinctive ones. And so back in the Chronicle of Higher Education in 2014, the person who was admissions director at Colby College at that time said, schools want to be something they're not. If you're Colby, you want to be Dartmouth. If you're Dartmouth, you want to be Harvard. Which always sounds to me like we're really good at doing A. So from now on, let's do Z. Let's be something that we're not good at. And at the same time we're doing that, we'll use language that really doesn't resonate well with faculty members. That's the fourth problem that I see. Now, every segment of society, every profession has its own buzzwords, its own vocabulary. In military culture, people talk about strategy and tactics and targets and winning. In the corporate world, it's all about KPIs, key performance indicators, benchmarks, SWOT analysis, return on investment. What do faculty members like to talk about? What keeps them awake at night? What do they argue about in faculty meetings? It's things like collegiality, academic freedom, tenure, critical thinking, shared governance. Well, if you look at the vocabulary that's used in strategic planning, all of it, 100% of it, comes from cultures outside the academy. And that's really not surprising. Look at that word strategic. That's a military word. And planning, well, we do planning in a lot of different segments of society. But in terms of business plans, financial plans, planning is very closely associated with the corporate world. None of those things that academics tend to care about show up in a lot of institutions' strategic plans or the way in which they present them to the faculty. And so faculty members check out. They just don't become all that involved in them. As Adriana Kazar says, using concepts foreign to the values of the academy will most likely fail to engage the very people who must bring about the change. Faculty members are a key constituent in making a strategic plan work. And if we don't speak with a vocabulary that matters to them, we leave them out. Strategic planning starts to sound to them sort of like an invasive species. And it kind of is. It wasn't developed in higher education. It was imported into higher education. Well, with all those thoughts in mind, what if we adopted an approach to strategic planning that incorporated more of the vocabulary and values that people in higher education actually care about? What would that look like? Well, I think there are 4 ways in which we can improve strategic planning by engaging in alternative processes. The first of these is scenario planning. Scenario planning says this: look, we don't know what the future is going to be like in 10 years. But we know the sorts of things that are going to affect that future for colleges and universities. Technology is going to be different. The environment's going to be different. Politics is going to be different. And so we look at these things that we call steeple drivers from the first letters of each of them, everything from how society is going to change to how demographics is going to change. And then we ask ourselves 3 questions about each driver. What's the best case scenario for that particular driver? What do we most hope is going to happen? What's the worst case scenario for each of those drivers? What do we most fear is going to happen? And then what do we think is the most likely case scenario for that particular driver? You see, that's what strategic planning does. It only looks at the most likely case scenario, but sometimes the most likely case scenario doesn't occur. Now, the best thing about scenario planning is you can then combine those different aspects of these drivers into different futures, such as suppose in 10 years, we had our best case scenario in demographics. The student body grew and our primary market grew exactly as we wanted to. But we had our worst case scenario in economics. The local economy was bad, the state economy was bad, the national economy was bad, and the most likely case scenario in politics. Politics developed kind of as we expected to. What would that future look like? And then you can start subbing these things out, adding in different most likely case scenarios, worst case scenarios, best case scenarios to imagine different types of futures. Now, you don't develop a full strategic plan for each one of those possible futures, but you get to ask the question, if the world were to look like that someday, what should we be doing now to protect ourselves? Even better, what should we be doing now so that we could thrive in a world that looked like that someday? And so you begin to think of the future as not being what you expect it to be, but what it could be. Now we can combine to that a second alternative change process, the strategic compass. What's a strategic compass? Well, a strategic plan is kind of like a map or an itinerary. It tells you exactly where you're going, how you're going to get there, and when you expect to arrive. A strategic compass outlines that general direction in which you want to move, but it doesn't give you exact routes or exact destinations, which to some people sounds like the opposite of strategic planning. Why would I want that? I want the plan so I know exactly what I'm going to do. We have to remember what we just learned about scenario planning. Because of all those changing scenarios, those maps, those plans are going to be wrong more often than they're right. Well, we need something to keep us moving in the right direction so we don't have that mission creep, so we keep doing what we're best at. Back in the 19th century, Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke said, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And for colleges and universities, the enemy is that unexpected future. Now, in the military world, as a result, the brothers Chip Heath and Dan Heath say in their book Made to Stick, commanders and generals and admirals plan differently nowadays. They do this thing called commander's intent. They say, if we do nothing else during tomorrow's mission, we have to do this. The single most important thing we must do tomorrow is this. And that keeps them guided in terms of what they absolutely have to accomplish. But what would be that compass that would keep us moving forward in the academic world? How would we set our strategic compass? Well, we might ask ourselves questions like, if we do nothing else during the next 3 years, What do we have to do? Or as a result, the single most important thing we must do this year is the following. That's our compass. That's our lodestone that keeps us moving in the right direction. Now, the third way in which we can improve strategic planning is to focus more on systems and less on goals. This idea actually comes from a sort of an unusual source. Scott Adams is the creator of Dilbert, that comic strip character who is always having trouble at work. Well, in his book, How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big, he talks about all the setbacks he had in his life and how he was able to overcome them by learning to focus on systems rather than always focusing on goals. What do we mean by systems and goals? Well, goals are those targets we set ourselves. I want to lose 40 pounds. I want to run a marathon in less than 4 hours. $10 million over the course of my lifetime. Or for a university, we want to be in the top 10 in US News and World Report rankings. Well, the systems are what get us there. I'm going to lose weight. I want to eat right. I'm going to run a marathon more quickly. I have to exercise every single day. If I want to make $10 million over the course of my career, I want to be a serial entrepreneur. And if I want to improve my ranking, I need to help each student become a success in his or her own terms. Well, Adam says the problem is we set those goals, develop those systems, but then we fixate on the goals. We spend 90% or more of our energy thinking about those goals and how we're going to achieve them, and less time focusing on the systems. We've got to reverse that. We have to focus 90% or more of our attention on our systems, and once we set our goals, almost set them aside. Why? Because goals involve planning, and planning anticipates that one future that may not occur. Our systems involve preparation, and preparation embraces all the possible futures that can arise. Now, strategic planning, with the targets that it sets, then pulls the institution, or at least tries to pull the institution towards those targets, whether it's easy to move it there or not. On the other hand, systems are those big ideas, those parts of your mission that really define who you distinctly are, and then they simply carry you where you need to go. That's important because, if you have a goal, like at the end of a year, I want to lose 40 pounds, and you weigh yourself at the end of the year, and probably a lot of us have done this with our diets, and you find that you haven't lost all the weight that you want, maybe you've only lost 25 pounds. How does that feel? It feels like a failure. You're probably going to give up. Whereas if we focus instead on our system, I'm going to eat right. I am now, from now on, a person who eats right. I am a healthy eater. That's how I see myself. And every day you define yourself in terms of that system. And at the end of the year, you found that because you're a healthy eater, you've now lost 25 pounds. That feels like a success. And here's the paradox. By focusing on the goal, we're less likely to achieve the goal. By focusing on the system, we're more likely to keep using that system and lose those 40 pounds. Maybe not in 1 year, but in a year and a half or 2 years. Well, the same thing is true in the academic world. If our goal is to attract 1,000 new students, and we only get 800, that feels like a failure. And so we throw all of our plans out the window. Whereas if we focus on our system, we want to emphasize student success from now on. And we find that by doing that, we have helped 800 more students achieve their dreams. That feels like a success. And we keep building upon the parts of that system that really worked. Now, the last way in which we can modify or improve strategic planning that I want to talk about today is something called appreciative inquiry. There are a lot of books about appreciative inquiry. The one I want to recommend is the book called The Power of Appreciative Inquiry, which tells the tale near the beginning of the book of BP ProCare, one of those auto service companies that tend to be in every city and town. Well, BP ProCare had an unusual record. Its customer approval rating was 90%, and that's almost unheard of in the auto service industry. But BP ProCare said, if we're doing this well, we can do even better. So they surveyed that 10% that didn't give them high rankings. What are we doing wrong? And then they tried to fix what they were doing wrong and modified what they did. And they found out that their customer approval rating, instead of going up, actually plummeted. They were asking the wrong question. They were focusing on their weaknesses, not building on their strengths. And we have to turn that around. We have to focus on our strengths, not fixate on our weaknesses. So if you ask yourself, what was our university or our college, our department like when it was at its best? What is our university or college or department best at doing and identify that and say, well, from now on, we're going to do more of that. We're going to build on that strength. That's the way in which you get better. Or if you think back and say, what was our proudest moment as an institution? When we're at our best, what do we look like? What do we do better than anyone else? And build upon that as our plan. You're much more likely to be distinctive, achieve your goals, and implement that system that's going to help you engage in the process that will make your institution more successful. So if we take these 4 ways of improving strategic planning and putting them together, that gives us the good ideas, the ways in which we can make strategic planning not just a mental exercise and something that sits on the shelf forever, but actually makes our institutions better. I want to thank you for this opportunity to share a few ideas with you today, and invite you, if you have any questions or any comments or any objections, simply to write me, jbuller@atlasleadership.com, and I'll be glad to see them and to answer you. In the meantime, I'm Jeff Buller, Senior Partner in Atlas Leadership Training. I hope you have a great conference.
I want to thank Dr. Buller for preparing that presentation for us. I'd like to remind everyone that as questions arise from these presentations, please feel free to share them in the chat, and we'll have time at the end of the presentation to address those. I've noticed a couple there already, so thank you. Our next 2 presenters will help us dive a little deeper into thinking about scenarios. I'd like to introduce Scott Friedman, Principal of Deloitte Consulting, and Cole Clark, Managing Director within the Higher Education Practice at Deloitte Services. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Just by way of quick introduction, I have been with Deloitte for about 5 years. Prior to that, I worked with another consulting company for about a decade, focused exclusively in higher education. So I've been serving university clients for about 15 years. Cole, do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having us today. I'm Cole Clark, not Clark Cole, as it says on the slide there. It's the curse of 2 last names or 2 first names. I've been with Deloitte just as long as Scott has. We were comparing notes the other day, and I think we joined on exactly the same day, although we came from very different backgrounds. While I've spent my whole career, 30 years, in education and nonprofit research, it's mostly been with technology companies in trying to sort of bridge the divide between the use of technology as a lever for transformation and the culture and context and unique circumstances in higher education. So again, glad to be with you all today.
If you could advance to the next slide. And I guess one more beyond that. Thank you. So there are really three things that we wanted to cover off on today, and apologies, we will be sort of shifting back and forth a little bit between the 2 of us. And again, feel free to throw questions in the chat. We're going to try to not take all of our time presenting and make sure that there's sufficient time at the end to allow for some questions. What we really wanted to talk about today was the impact of COVID on higher education as an industry, spending a little bit of time focusing on scenarios that we as a firm have developed to not as a mechanism to try to predict the future, sort of in relation to what we were just hearing about, scenarios not to predict the future, but rather as a mechanism to help us think about how we might want to approach a wide variety of potential different futures. And to think more strategically about those, and then ultimately share our perspectives on where higher education is going, almost agnostic to the pandemic. Next slide, please. So, in the face of the COVID pandemic and the ongoing fight for social justice, we really have in front of us a critical opportunity to rethink diversity, equity, and inclusion in the landscape of higher ed. And it's our suggestion, our perspective that this is something frankly that shouldn't be wasted. That we have the opportunity now to have a conversation about these facts, and how we can help to critically reshape the industry to be more inclusive, to close the attainment gap, to provide more opportunities and experiences for all students to achieve the outcomes that they're hoping from from higher education. The only other point I'll raise here is, I found it very interesting. I actually referenced this when we did a Meet the Experts conversation when Cole and I did that on Tuesday. But I actually did some work with the Gates Foundation several years ago, looking at some 2-year and 4-year public institutions that have constrained resources. And these were institutions that the Gates Foundation had identified as having done a good job at increasing retention, increasing graduation rates, and closing the attainment gap. And actually, one of the most important findings that we had was that for those institutions, the way they actually thought about and measured student success was not specifically around retention and graduation rates, but it was actually helping students to achieve the goals that they came in with. Whether that was taking a couple of courses to, get a promotion at work, or developing skills and capabilities to allow them to seek some external certification, even if the sort of, formal sort of result wasn't delivered by the institution, they still viewed that as a success. And I found that to be an especially powerful sort of perspective on higher education, and how I would suggest that we sort of continue to think about the industry and changes and shifts in the industry as we move forward into the next decade. Next slide, please. Obviously, the pandemic has sort of put our industry in a great deal of upheaval, frankly, and I think that's probably true for most other industries. We have talked about this sort of 3-tiered response, recover, thrive schema, if you will, in terms of the reaction to COVID, and thinking about how we sort of reestablish, quote unquote, some sense of normalcy, but then leverage that as a mechanism to actually change and do things differently, do things better, be more progressive, have greater outcomes, impact people's lives in better ways. So obviously, a lot of time was spent in the spring, really just responding, moving classes online, creating that, trying to do the best that institutions could to create some type of experience for students. Obviously, we're sort of in the middle of this recover phase right now, which is institutions attempting, in some cases somewhat successfully, in other cases not very successfully, to reopen and bring students back onto campus in some way, shape, or form. But really, the focus here is not simply attempting to recover, but attempting to understand what thriving looks like. How do we rethink the industry to provide greater access and improve equity and inclusion across the board? Next slide, please. Oh, there it goes. As I'm sure everyone on this conference knows, the pandemic is disproportionately impacting communities of color. So for every white American, the mortality rate for Asians is 1.5 times. For Latinx individuals, it's 2.5 times. For Pacific Islanders, it's 2.6 times. And for American Indians and Blacks, it's actually greater than 3 times the mortality rate for whites. We're also seeing significant shifts, and Chris referenced this earlier, but enrollment is down across the board at community colleges, across all racial and ethnic groups. So there is really a challenge, obviously, that COVID is presenting to frankly to our entire student population. But obviously the pandemic writ large is really having a disproportionate impact on communities of color. Next slide, please. And actually, I think it might be 2 slides simultaneously. Thank you. So what we did as a firm was put together for all industries some scenarios about the way the pandemic may unfold and what the implications of those scenarios would be on various industries. The goal here was not, as I said earlier, not necessarily to be predictive about what the future would look like, but rather as a mechanism to help institutions, to help businesses, depending on the industry, think more strategically, more holistically about what the future might look like, so as to be more strategic. If you could move to the next slide. We really identified that there were two important uncertainties that would drive the lasting impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, this is really sort of industry agnostic, but understanding if this was going to be creating a rapid peak, if there would be sort of self-dampening, if there would be sort of a gradual progression of the disease, if it would be a roller coaster, or if it would be effectively sort of like a multi-peak type of event. And to understand the level of impact that the pandemic would have on the disease. I think it's important to note at this point that this is material that we actually put together back in April or May. I think that most would argue right now that we're on the far right end of this spectrum, right? Like, some would argue that the disease progression in the U.S. has been somewhat of a roller coaster. Others would probably say we've had a second act already. We may be approaching the third act if we listen to sort of what public health officials are saying right now. So obviously the disease has had a significant impact on our industry and on all industries. And, for all intents and purposes, it seems that is only, potentially exacerbating right now. And then the second question was, what do we perceive as the level of collaboration within and between countries? Is there sort of a clear coordinated response between countries, or is the response really weak and divided, where there's no coordination, there's no accountability, and there's really insufficient and even responses to address the reality of what's going on with the pandemic? And again, on this one, I think most would sort of suggest that the response was really weak and divided. I mean, you could even see that, frankly, within the confines of the U.S. itself. You have 50 different states, obviously, and each jurisdiction has its own approaches, responses, rules, regulations, and that has definitely created some challenges and is creating impacts, obviously, on our industry. If you jump to the next slide. So this really created or allowed us to create these sort of four scenarios that we wanted to walk through. So the first, the top left, is this idea of a passing storm, where the pandemic is really managed effectively and results from responses by governments to contain the virus. There's still lasting repercussions that do exacerbate some socioeconomic inequalities. Ultimately, though, the health system and the policy response was reasonably effective. In the second scenario, which we call good company in the bottom left, we found that one potential sort of set of responses was the governments really would struggle to handle the crisis, but you'd see large corporations stepping in as a key part of the solution, and really sort of accelerating this idea of stakeholder capitalism. The impacts, the pandemic in this circumstance would be more prolonged, but there would be more of a coordinated response. It's just the response would be coordinated more by corporations than by governmental entities. The third scenario that we had identified was this sort of lone wolves, or sorry, the sunrise in the east scenario, the bottom right, which was really, and one could argue that this may be to some extent what is taking shape right now, where China and other East Asian nations are the ones that are more effective in managing the virus and start to take more of the reins of primary powers on the world stage. Again, this assumes that the pandemic is severe, but that there is more collaboration amongst countries, but that collaboration is really run from Asia more so from the U.S. and Western Europe. And then the fourth scenario, the truly scary scenario, was the one that we termed lone wolves. And this scenario was really a prolonged pandemic period with sort of constant rolling pandemics where there's really no kind of end in sight. Vaccines in this scenario are not really terribly effective, or they're not safe. There's really sort of a constant progression of the disease, and it really spurs governments to adopt isolationist policy, shorten supply chain, increase surveillance. Unfortunately, I think folks could argue that we've seen some of this already, across the world and in the United States as well. And this is really one of the critical pieces here is obviously that there is low global coordination and ultimately weak policy response. So if you take the frame that I shared on the previous slide and apply these different scenarios to that frame, you sort of see where we plot these different scenarios in terms of the level of collaboration and the severity of the pandemic on the right-hand side. So again,
I think, Scott, if I could just quickly add, when we developed these as a firm, although it's difficult to convey this when they're in discrete boxes on the screen and you've got the bubbles on the chart. The idea was that obviously no one can predict the future, and that there would likely be elements of all of these that may come to pass. And so I would urge you not to think of them as mutually exclusive, because we don't. Although the way that they're depicted on the screen and the way we sort of talk about them discreetly would lead you to believe that these are 4 discrete scenarios. In fact, I think there are elements of all of them that we've observed in the past few months since we put this together.
Fair enough. Do you want to start to talk about the passing storm, Cole?
Yeah, so could we advance to the next slide? So in this, and again, as Scott mentioned earlier, there are elements of the scenarios that have, a global context, which Scott sort of outlined here, but the passing storm elements included, early and effective health system responses and political responses that really got the pandemic under control in a reasonably short amount of time. That there would be be stimulus funding globally that would buffer and limit some of the shocks, the economic shocks that would be a result of all the lockdowns and social distancing that needed to take place as a health system intervention. And that there would be a metering of consumer confidence as a result of that, funding support for in many countries. And then, what we tried to do was drill down and look at what the impacts on the higher education sector would be in that scenario. So we, in this particular case, we indicated that the downturn that would result, even though it would be buffered somewhat by some of the spending that would take place by governments around the world, there would still be this increase in the divide between the leading institutions, those that have been very successful pre-pandemic, and those that were already struggling. I think we'll get to this in a bit, but there were a number of sort of subsectors within the higher education panoply that were in difficulty before the pandemic hit, and we saw this as just increasing to acting as an accelerant for some of those disparities. The other point was that while there was a lot of talk about 2020 being the tipping point for online education, and certainly we've seen a number of native online institutions grow quite considerably over the last decade. In this particular scenario, that pace of change we felt would continue to be somewhat incremental as opposed to revolutionary, and that the overall structure of our sector, community colleges, public and private 4 years that are regional in nature, large private and public land grant and research focused institutions. And then there's all, that's a gross oversimplification, but certainly lots of other segments of the higher ed sector. That overall, that general model would remain largely as it was pre-pandemic. Let's go on to the next one, and Scott will walk through the good company scenario.
Thanks. So in this one, again, the idea was really that banks and other businesses are taking the initiative to combat the virus spread and support recovery, that the governments have effectively failed to respond effectively, but the corporate sector it has stepped in. Again, this sort of signals a shift towards greater corporate responsibility and greater emphasis on investing in communities and workers. From a timing perspective, the perspective here was that recovery would probably begin in late 2021. It would start very slow and ideally speed up by the second half of 2022. So from a higher ed perspective here, we saw two-year institutions presumably seeing an uptick in enrollment as the sort of recovery starts, as ultimately you have increased demand for stacked credentials and certificates. The traditional 4-year degree maybe is a little bit less sought after in this model. As a result of the funding drop from government, there is potentially more consolidation into sort of regional centers, and that those centers are more aligned to where population exists, and there's more of a linkage between the university or the college and regional employers. We saw a shift for those institutions that really have sizable research portfolios, that research really focuses towards things like medicine, population health, and supply chain management. And that there really are increasingly alliances that exist or that are stood up between employers and regional institutions, largely two-year institutions. From a student perspective, we saw this model or this scenario potentially creating, a perception that the quote-unquote residential experience is more of a luxury good. There's now more price sensitivity, presumably, and so students and families are more clearly questioning or delineating the cost of education and the cost of the college experience. And we would potentially envision in this circumstance more and more students sort of questioning the value, like, show me the value of my student experience, show me the value of a college education, which again we think would further highlight that perception that a on-campus residential experience might be more of a luxury good going forward. And then from a funding perspective, we saw significant increases in private sponsorship of research, and also potentially declining endowments. As a result that, growth of large companies are really the ones that are kind of helping the market rebound. And so more investment is coming into the corporate sector rather than the higher ed sector. So if you want to flip to the next slide.
So in this third scenario, which we entitled Sunrise in the East, this really focused on, as Scott mentioned before, a big divide between East and West in terms of the emergence and recovery period and duration of the pandemic period relative to recovery between Eastern and Western geographical segments of the country, of the world. In this scenario, as it relates to a bit more about the context, and I think in the last several months, the last quarter, we've seen some elements of this. that a number of Asian economies have rebounded faster. They have employed more draconian health interventions in order to tamp down the virus's spread and control it faster. And they've continued to impose those whenever there's been a flare-up. So they've been able to accelerate their recovery and reopening in certain parts of those geographies. In the West, by contrast, the pandemic, continues. There's a greater need for economic support from governments. There's tremendous government spending in order to keep certain sectors of the economy afloat. And in the East, as I mentioned, there's this acceptance of government's role in instituting some of these surveillance and other health interventions in order to preserve the public good. As higher ed in this scenario really is a tale of sort of two orbits, where higher ed in the West goes into a broad structural decline. There's certainly a huge cutoff as it relates to international students, especially from Asia, coming into U.S. institutions. And as a result, Asian powers being able to attract more students from other parts of the globe. There's an increase in the rate of investment in their own institutions. We've already seen some evidence of this prior to the pandemic, and in this scenario, we would predict that it would get more, it would accelerate. The mobility patterns of international students would shift towards Asia as opposed to a net outflow, and U.S. higher education would get further caught in what is already this crossfire between anti-globalist and nationalistic movements in the West relative to their desire to import more students from outside the United States. So this again, I think we're already seeing the early signs of some of this today. Not all of it is necessarily pandemic related, but it is a trend that I think the pandemic has accelerated. And we'll go to the fourth one. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you. Nice. So this is the fourth scenario, the sort of scariest scenario, if you will, that we entitled Lone Wolves. Again, in this one, the virus continues to mutate and evolve. Countries de-emphasize working together and really become more increasingly isolationist. And the recovery, potentially is starting by mid-2022, but the rates of recovery are incredibly divergent across countries. For the higher ed context, we see this one creating sort of breakdowns between and amongst institutional classifications, and the time-based progression, calendar-driven scheduling are really unworkable with these rolling, unpredictable lockdowns. So you sort of see a breakdown in the kind of, in some ways, in the traditional model of higher education and the higher education calendar. As a result of this, we see potentially research institutions focusing on developing small cohorts of traditional students more of a traditional immersive experience. But again, we see this becoming the province of the wealthy, where you sort of have largely walled off institutions, schools that do have some international cachet and have the ability to deliver a robust student experience are presumably able to attract some international students. But ultimately, these institutions are really focused on, or need to focus on, developing high quality distance education that is really at a higher price point. We see, mega universities like the ASUs, the Southern New Hampshires, the Western Governors Universities of the world really thriving in this environment because they presumably are the locus of safe and affordable education. We do see increased demand for two-year institutions. suggesting that these schools would ultimately probably retool to focus exclusively on the skills that require hands-on training and really continue the transition or the move towards a competency-based and away from degree-based education. We would see an increase presumably in corporate training programs here and industry trade groups that are developing programs that might ultimately take some of the place of higher education. In this circumstance, there may be some positive impacts on diversity, equity, inclusion in that we would envision potentially income disparity between those with a degree and those with high school education equivalency ultimately maybe shrinks. The few institutions that do continue to offer residential programs become sort of sanctuary campuses. And we would expect in this circumstance that actual sort of degree seeking and enrollment in higher ed writ large would potentially drop markedly, as well as the student import-export imbalance, would drop significantly, as you would have, a lot fewer students seeking to, attend higher education institutions outside of their home country. In this scenario, skills are valued more than degrees. As fewer employers are presumably extant and as fewer employees are hiring, the employer ultimately is going to have a greater stake in the value of education and may become increasingly involved in curriculum design and even school creation. And again, in this model, presumably tax bases are significantly less, and so public funding, which has already been shrinking, is reduced to very little to support higher education. You end up in a circumstance again where institutions are struggling to find the financial resources that they need to remain. And as a result, we would expect that especially tuition-dependent universities and especially four-year tuition-dependent universities would ultimately be decimated in this model. So again, as Cole referenced before we started talking about these four scenarios in a little bit more detail, we do see elements of this as well as elements of each of the other scenarios in sort of what has progressed so far. So with that, I will, if you want to advance to the next section.
All right, we're going to now kind of take a look at broader trends in the sector and a few things that were already, I think, under discussion and underway from an imperatives standpoint that the pandemic has helped to shine a brighter spotlight on and accentuate. The one point that I want to make out of this clever little graphic is that institutional behavior, institutional leadership is shaped and driven by so many different stakeholders and constituents. And it seems as if the pandemic has just made this all the more intense. Students, faculty, staff, at one level, the media focus on higher education as it's tried to navigate the pandemic, the pressures from the local community that the institution sits within, the city or town or county, and the push and pull of what the economic support that institution provides, but also the threat and the concern that bringing hundreds and thousands of outsiders back to campus means for that locality. I don't think there's ever been a time in our lifetimes when we've had so many different forces and stakeholders pushing and pulling on institutional leadership and institutional behavior than now. And unfortunately, I don't think it's understood or fully acknowledged or recognized by the broader community. It's a really, really tough time to be a leader or frankly any member of the college or university community at this stage. Next slide. What you'll see, there it comes, when I was going to say, when the next slide finally does appear, we tried to distill down to sort of 10 elements, those things that were opportunities for change in higher education that are really not pandemic specific, but that the pandemic may provide us with a real opportunity to affect change. I forget who coined the phrase, but the whole that hackneyed statement, "Never waste a crisis," comes to mind. There are definitely some things that certainly were underway, or at least were acknowledged as important, but hadn't really seen even progress across the sector. I'll just briefly touch on a few of these, and Scott will chime in here just so that I'm not monopolizing the conversation. We tend to finish each other's sentences anyway, so this should be somewhat natural. I'll start on the right-hand side of the screen with the revisiting the academic portfolio. There's definitely been this broader sort of perception of is the value there, and some of that has been hyped by the constant media coverage revolving around the increasing shift of the cost of education to students and parents and away from public support. And I think that's what's really, and as well as the increasing levels of student debt that have occurred as a result. But I think that this pandemic provides us with a real opportunity to get laser focused on outcomes and student centricity, and then looking at making sure that our academic portfolios are connected to what it is that our employers need, as well as what it takes to further develop the individual. And so that's certainly an area of opportunity. I think the other related opportunity here is the coordination of the academic portfolio, especially in systems, both at the state level as well as at the municipal level, and ensuring that there's adequate collaboration and coordination and reduction of friction across systems, so that individual students can consume educational content from multiple institutions and assemble a degree without a tremendous amount of needless friction in doing so, and that there is coordination as opposed to competition between the elements of a public system, so that the needs of the community are kind of put at the forefront of the development of that portfolio versus, how can we maximize our specific institutional enrollments, relative to the other institutions.
And also, I would just add there also, I think, increased interplay between systems within a jurisdiction, right? So between the state college system, the state university system, and the community college system that exists, because I think, as we see increases in pathways, as we see sort of increased experiments around, free community college and free, access to four-year institutions once you have a community college degree, or once you have an associate's degree, I do think that we're going to see increases in, collaboration between systems that exist within the same jurisdiction.
The next one I'll pick on for a minute is the top right, curate the student experience. This is a bit of a hackneyed, overused term as well. But I think in this context, when we've all been forced at some point during the year, in some of your experiences, you may still be in this modality of having to deliver instructional content entirely remotely, and effectively discontinue or severely curtail a lot of the residential components of campus life or institutional life. That rethinking the student experience in being able to deliver that 360-degree community of care around the student in hybrid and online modalities has never been more kind of in focus than it is now. And I think, the broader community outside of the higher ed sector views remote higher ed as moving instruction online, full stop. And I think we all know that that is not the complete picture. So how to preserve or adapt or provide the richness that exists in a residential experience in a hybrid or flexible modality is really, really difficult and not inexpensive. It is an expensive undertaking, both in terms of people and technology. So this is something that's going to require, I think, a lot of careful thought and outside help, quite frankly, whether that be through the use of entities that have experience in developing online curricula or bringing in more instructional design assistance. But I think it is something that's going to require quite a bit of focus. Scott, do you have one that you want to just pick on?
I mean, unfortunately, I think the two bottom left ones around sort of rethinking administration and operations and assessing financial health are critical. They were critical before COVID, and I think the pandemic has only exacerbated some of the economic struggles that institutions are facing. And so I think that we're already seeing a lot of institutions be more thoughtful about where there are opportunities to be more effective, more efficient with their resources. Again, with the goal of not only to cut costs, but also to be able to have resources to invest back in that student experience, understanding that ultimately that's going to be sort of critical. And I'm looking at the chat and I'm seeing that there's a lot of sort of conversation around the criticality of the student experience. And that really is what institutions need to be focusing their energies and efforts on. So, we're already seeing some of this. I would say, maybe a decade ago, 12 years ago, there was a big push around, this idea of, resource optimization in higher ed. How can we do more with less? State funding is being cut. We need to be more, more appropriate or more considerate of the resources that we have. I think that trend is sort of coming around again, but again, the goal needs to be a focus on how we can improve the student experience and how we can talk to, our communities, our stakeholders, faculty, staff, students about the importance of improving the student experience as a mechanism to justify, being a little bit more thoughtful and aggressive in terms of the changes that we need to make to our operations and administrative structures.
One I'll pick on for a bit is the use of information to make better decisions. I think this is something that we as a sector have really struggled with. There are many positives and positive elements to the mode of governance that we employ in our institutions. Shared governance and academic freedom have tremendous value, but one of the unfortunate negative consequences there is that we've tended to stand up systems in our institutions that are siloed and don't give us the ability to easily and in very real time look at broad enterprise-wide trends, scenario model, plan effectively at an enterprise level. And that's been a dragon that we have unfortunately just not been able to slay in our sector yet. And I think this is another area where I believe, and I know there's others that believe that there are ways to get at this without necessarily encroaching on the model of shared governance that exists in our institutions. It involves at a leadership level, really viewing data and information as an institutional asset, not an asset that exists at the unit or division or college or school level, and getting universal buy-in to that concept as a foundation before then moving on to the steps of putting these capabilities in place that allow you to make rational, reasoned decisions about what to do, what not to do, and what things to invest in, and frankly, what things to disinvest in. We as a sector are really challenged when it comes to deciding what not to do anymore. And it goes back to that strategic planning video that we saw from Jeff earlier, which is so critical when we examine, what we want to accomplish. I think we have to remember that it's just as important to focus on what it is we're going to do more of, and what we're going to do less of, and using data and analytics to drive that conversation takes a lot of the heat, out of the discussion, and really helps to make the conversation a bit more focused and rational.
Yeah, and the only other thing I'd add there is by the same token, we do a really good job in higher ed of creating new, but when that creation is no longer serving its purpose, we don't do a good job of saying, okay, we're not using this anymore, we're not doing this anymore, so let's take it apart and like reallocate that resource base to something else. We're not really adept at making those choices.
Maybe in the interest of time, let's go to the next slide. We're going to drill down on one of the 10 here that we didn't talk about, and that's invest in academic digitization. I struggle to come up with a good word that doesn't sound too buzzwordy or hyperbolic or trite. The notion here is what I was talking about earlier around the student experience, which is really investing in curating these blended experiences that really leverage the value and the sort of ineffable qualities that our residential experiences bring and experiential education brings with online and technological tools for teaching and learning. I think that what we're learning from the few months that we've been at this is that many of our not only traditional students, but certainly that broad cohort of adults who are working and have some college or no college, or some college and no degree, are really primed for this blended approach. And what this gets at is a need to rethink almost the entire mode of operations of our institutions. It's not just about moving lectures to Zoom. We have to rethink things like the academic calendar, and consider things like termless modes of enrolling and in matriculating into the institution. We need to think about the time and place elements of when these individuals can be actively engaged, and when they have to be involved in other things, and understand that there's an on-demand nature to the delivery of education. But I think that the in-person experiences are just as important, and that moving to a fully online delivery is probably suboptimal. That many of our online students want to actually have some sort of experiential component and social component. I think that the social aspects of learning are often missed in this rush to online that we've been involved in over the past several months. There's an excellent article that I'd urge all of you to look up from Michael Feldstein called Digital Residential Education, and it really gets at this question of the social components of learning and how that's often left out in some of the online modes that we are engaged in today. And then the other thing I think is that's often forgotten is that higher education is largely local, and that even 75% of students that have been enrolling in online programs, this is a pre-pandemic stat, 3/4 of them were within 100 miles of their home, the institutions that they were enrolling in. So this suggests that that these hybrid modes are actually quite plausible and feasible, given the fact that most students are interested in enrolling in institutions that are not that far away. Scott, did you have anything to add on this?
No, I mean, I think I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, I think we should probably open it up for questions because I realize we only have a couple more minutes.
This was our last slide anyway. There's actually 4 more in the deck that are really deep dives into the 4 scenarios that we didn't intend to cover in any depth, but they're available for you to look at later on.
Great. Well, I want to thank Jeffrey, Scott, and Cole for their informative and thought-provoking presentations. I can tell you that there's been a very robust conversation in the chat that's sort of spoken to the tensions that community colleges are facing right now in terms of trying to balance all of the pieces. There have been discussions about whether we're an industry or not and who our customers are. And then it really speaks to a lot of the things that you've talked about in terms of we're trying to focus on the outside influences, state government, federal government, community, at the same time trying to balance student success, right? And you saw some information in there about the culturally responsive pedagogy and teaching that we're trying to put in there. So it did speak to a lot of those difficulties in balancing a lot of these. I'm kind of curious. There was a couple of questions that were related to what you talked about toward the end, and those were, how do we, as a community college where we have a very local base of our students and our community, really sort of leverage some of the local businesses, the community, the corporate responsibility, but in this case, a lot of local businesses to really try to help. How do we leverage that as a new interest during this time frame? In terms of community colleges?
So in terms of sort of the physical assets?
Well, not just the physical assets, but really partnering with them, right? Is there a more unique way that we can begin to partner with them during this time frame?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I think, and I'm sure many institutions are already doing this, but engaging with the corporate sector in sort of curriculum development. So understanding what the employers that are ultimately going to hire your students are seeking or needing. The other thing is, I think, and this does actually have to do with the question about the physical space, which I did see in the chat. There are mechanisms that you can engage with with partners, whether they're municipal partners or corporate partners, around how to potentially take advantage of the physical property that you have to promote training for those corporations. So maybe that the institution itself is not the one that's sort of putting on or producing content, but the facilities, the resources that you have may be something that the municipality will need, or that the corporate sector in your catchment area will need. The one I as part of that Gates work that I referenced earlier, we actually visited Indian River State College in sort of the northeast part of, I guess, just east central part of Florida, and they had an incredibly impressive sort of training facility for municipal workers, so for fire and rescue and for EMT and police, that they were built on their campus. So I think models like that are possibly a good potential use of partnership with municipalities, partnership with corporations, and then also use of physical space, especially in a world where there's an increasing push towards online, and as a result of the push towards online, potentially less need for physical space.
You mentioned in one portion, you talked about the fiscal challenges, of course, that colleges are going to have to be dealing with. So given a lot of those budget pressures, how do you see colleges thinking about, what are they going to need to think about in order to allocate funding towards issues of equity inclusion that you touched on at the very beginning of your presentation?
Well, I tend to, people that know me know that I tend to be somewhat of a fiscal conservative, but this is where I'm unabashedly in the opposite camp. I think we've been through now over a decade of disinvesting in education, especially at the 2-year level in our public public systems of higher education, and there's no room to shift more of the burden onto students and parents. That elasticity has reached its breaking point. Without some pretty significant, I think, investment from the public sector in education, it's going to be really challenging to effectuate a lot of the changes that Scott and I have been talking about, especially the curation of a high quality student experience that's both online and in person. As definitely ways in which we can address the cost side of the equation to kind of get at your question more directly. And I'm by no means saying that we've done all we can do as a sector to address that, either through, as Scott was mentioning, being much more critical about what we don't do any longer and disinvesting in some areas, but also just taking advantages of scale economies and efficiencies that exist in systems of education at a state or municipal level. I mean, there are many, many opportunities to address the cost side, but I also think that we've shifted about as much of the revenue equation to students and parents as we can possibly push, and there is going to be a need for some investment in this, hopefully coming out of the pandemic, because education is so critical to reviving economic vitality. There will be some awareness of that need.
I would only say, though, that I don't think that only has to come from the public sphere. I think that can come from the private sphere as well, from corporations. We see increasing relationships between at least large corporations and universities in terms of the development of benefits, employee benefits programs that include attendance at university as part of those benefits. So I think we need to see more investment, not only from the public sphere but also from the private sphere as well.
Thank you. We've got just a couple more minutes before this session ends, and then we'll shift to our other session. But I can imagine there's probably maybe more than one person on this session that's interested in what you think. Which of these scenarios that you've talked about do you see community colleges most closely following?
That's a tough one to answer. I mean, I think as I mentioned before, I think we didn't really think about the 4 scenarios as being entirely discrete. And I think I'm going to avoid your question a little bit and just say that what I'm worried about is the precipitous drop that we're seeing in community college enrollments here in the near term across all demographics. I mean, we accentuated or highlighted how it seems to be a little bit more heavily weighted in communities of color, but it's a drop across the board. And normally in a recession, you would see the opposite effect, and maybe we will as we move into 2021. But I think the facts are the impacts of the current state, not getting into the scenarios too directly, is that enrollments are falling, and I've not yet gotten really under the covers enough to understand exactly what is behind that in the short term, but it is extremely troubling.
Thank you.
And is that a sort of pandemic blip, or is that something that potentially has sort of longer legs and is really just a exacerbation of maybe a conversation that was already occurring in terms of the sort of abiding value of higher ed that existed sort of in the public sphere prior to the pandemic?
Thank you. Well, so I'd like to again thank Cole and Scott for sharing your time with us, and I want to invite all of you to stay with us in the same room for the Meet the Expert session that's going to immediately follow this, where you'll have an additional chance to, we have a chance to ask our presenters additional questions. Alternately, you can visit the Expo Hall to meet with sponsors, representatives from the ATD Network Engagement Team, or our Gateway to College team. Or you can enjoy a short break. But mostly I want to say thank you very much for attending this session, and have a great rest of the day. So we're about a minute early, so we'll give folks a chance to settle out here. So we have about 20 minutes with Cole and Scott. And if you'd like to share any questions that you have or would like to comments or questions, and I think Cole, you and Scott both can see the chat. This is a little more informal, so folks will be asking questions in the chat, and I've got a couple from earlier sessions that I can also continue to ask, but it looks like Dustin has something. If you look at the landscape in higher education, do you think we have too many institutions? You know, are the massive institutions the way of the future? You know, I'm assuming MOOCs and other types of things, or is it better to keep institutions local and have, you know, more small institutions?
So the answer to the first question is yes, there are too many institutions, but I don't think that the answer is just a lot of mega institutions. I think the answer is a combination of those large institutions where, you know, there's less opportunity for in-person experience and sort of and engagement, and then the, you know, local institutions that are really, in many cases, the lifeblood of their local communities, serve a really critical role and also provide opportunities for students to interact and engage. It's also important, again, and I know that there's been a lot of conversation in the chat about, you know, how well linked should higher ed be with vocation? And obviously, it's critical that, you know, we're teaching students general skills as well as capabilities, you know, to be able to perform individual jobs. But it is ultimately, you know, important. And I think that, you know, I referenced the sort of, you know, social conversation that's occurring right now in terms of, you know, the abiding value of higher ed. And I believe that there's been an increased focus on the direct linkage between a degree and vocation. And so given that sort of shift or a shift towards more of a shift towards a focus there, I do think that it's important for local institutions to have those relationships with employers so that they are providing the training, the skills, the capabilities to students that are ultimately going to be seeking employment in the, you know, in their local area, in their catchment area. Because if institutions, especially 2-year and, you know, regional 4-year institutions, are not effective at doing that, they're going to be in trouble, frankly, financially longer term, because students aren't necessarily going to align. So, you know, I agree with the commentary that it can't all be about, you know, vocation, but I think that there needs to be cognizance taken of the importance of vocation to the student and to the family as part of the sort of construct of higher ed. I don't know.
Yeah, I would add that I think the reason that Western governors in Southern New Hampshire have been so successful over such a relatively short period of time relative to the, you know, broader timeline of higher ed in this country is that they met a market need that was going largely unmet, which is a modality that catered to adult learners primarily with some college or no degree or no college at all, that needed to learn in a very sort of on-demand asynchronous mode that took, in the case of Western governors, principally in Southern New Hampshire to some extent, leveraged this competency-based model that allowed for the ability to leverage prior learning and move at one's own pace while still preserving, academic quality and being an accredited institution and whatnot, but really meeting a need that a traditional residential institution couldn't meet. Now, as that has taken root, a lot of what we would think of as traditional students, the 18 to 24-year-olds, have started to gravitate towards these institutions as well. It's not by any means the majority of their enrollment, but it's no longer just adult learners that are taking advantage of these systems. So I think much like the impacts of other big shifts like MOOCs and online instruction, it's having an effect, a forcing function on the broader sector to rethink how different, what is my target demographic? What do they need, and how can I shift how I deliver that to meet not only their needs, but also maybe look at adjacencies and cater to other types of students. But I think that the sheer quantity of institutions that exists in the country is too great. I mean, there's going to be a consolidation. I don't want to be a prophesier of doom and gloom, but I think we're going to see a great shaking out in the coming year, because the full impact of what we're just beginning to see now in the fall of this year is not really going to be the full brunt of that economic club is not going to be felt. The impact of that's not going to be felt really, I think, forcefully until the end of this year and the early part of next year. But I also think that while that sounds very doom and gloomish, this is a real opportunity to reshape and rethink and look at potential collaborations, mergers, integrations, ways to preserve the mission of the institution without necessarily just disappearing.
Yeah, I read an interesting article yesterday that talked about some of the education that's going to actually go on within the corporations themselves, right? That you were, Google and some of these other places that are just saying we're just going to bring people in and we're going to do the education ourselves, or they're even providing the curriculum themselves, and that's going to be a bit of a challenge. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Well, two things there. I mean, we actually sort of see that already. That's in many ways already occurring in India, and probably in other jurisdictions. But I have a little bit of familiarity with India, where you have corporations that are starting up universities that are basically connected physically to, to the corporation that are enrolling thousands of students. You could argue about, we could have arguments about sort of the academic freedom that exists in those types of institutions. I'm not supporting it, but it's definitely something that happened. And even Deloitte, we have, something that we call Deloitte University. It's not in a university, it's not accredited, it doesn't provide degrees, but it is something that we use as a mechanism to sort of train our own, our own people in specific skills and capabilities that, that the firm is trying to ensure get developed. So I think, again, not saying right, nor wrong, nor indifferent, but I think it's important to understand that is a shift that is occurring, whether we want it to or not.
Right. Let me ask a couple of questions that have come up about the scenarios. And Cole, I know that you said at the very end, you're kind of like, well, it could be a little bit of all of these, right? Susan was asking, how can colleges think about the probabilities or likelihood? And this is talking about the probabilities and likelihood of certain scenarios or parts of scenarios playing out. And it actually made me go back to Jeffrey Buller's presentation, where if you look at these steepled aspects where you could find some pieces play out and mix and match from these different scenarios, how would you recommend that colleges think about that and actually approach planning if they're going to have to try to figure out which of these things are going to happen? Should they plan for each of the parts and mix and match the parts? I mean, what would your suggestion be?
I mean, do you want me to take this first call and then you can jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
We may have very different answers to this, because I don't think this is not something that we've ever talked about. But I think the ideal state would be, again, and these are scenarios. I did see somewhere in the chat someone asked the question of how we came up with them. So just as a little bit of background that I didn't really give earlier, the firm Deloitte actually came up with these broader scenarios, and then we took the scenarios and applied them to higher ed. They are not, there are many different potential avenues that the pandemic could obviously take and responses could take. I think the important thing here is to try to understand where there's commonality, and focus on that commonality, right? So if you understand these are four ways that this could all progress, and where do you see yourselves playing in each of these different scenarios? And then once you sort of identify that, where are the commonalities? Because that's probably a good signal that that's an area or arena in which you should focus, because it's almost like, irrespective of, this is a severe kind of thing that goes on for a decade versus, we're going to we're going to hit a point in time in the next 9 months where, we're going to have a vaccine, and the vaccine is going to be magically, 85 to 90% effective. And, everyone's going to take the vaccine, and, COVID over a period of a couple of years is going to be eradicated, right? Like, I don't think either of those extremes is really what's going to happen. But where you find commonality in the way that you would respond to different scenarios, that's probably a signal that that's a good strategy to take.
Okay.
Yeah, and I guess I would add to that going back to that slide of the 10, the 10 opportunities, irrespective of the pandemic. I mean, there are a number of safe bets in there that are going to be effective strategies, no matter what scenario or what combination of elements of the scenarios that we put forward actually come to pass. Things like investing in this sort of digitization of the academic enterprise, the imperative to take cost out and to leverage scale economies, to be very attentive to what our students, whether they be adult learners or traditional, 18 to 22-year-olds, are telling us about why they choose to invest time and resources in a post-secondary degree and that, or some sort of credential. And then, the polling, with all due respect to the conversation that's taking place in the chat about needing to develop the person, which I fully believe in, the number one response that we get time and time again is that individuals go to college to get a job. There's many other things below that they express an interest in, but the vocational aspect of this is important. And so investing in ensuring that your academic program array is connected to that objective, and that there are connections to employers and to the in the local community, I think is another safe bet. So I would suggest going back to that slide of 10 opportunities and thinking about how those could be incorporated into your institution's short and long-term strategy.
And just to add to that, I think if you're not focused on how you're sort of interacting with the large corporations in your catchment area, your competitors probably are. And that's just an important thing to know, because I know I've had conversations with, many clients about that specific thing, right? A lot of the work that Cole and I do has something to do with some of the work that we do relates to mergers, consolidation, at least sort of initial thoughts and strategies around that. Several conversations I've had with university clients have not been around creating partnerships or mergers with other universities, but rather thinking about more of that direct linkage to corporations. And can we merge with a corporation, or can we partner? And we're seeing also an increase in sort of for-profit training programs that are getting accredited and are seeing themselves as effectively colleges or universities. So I think that's only a trend we're going to see continue.
Yeah, thank you. I want to remind everyone that if you have questions, please don't hesitate to share them in the chat so that we can ask our presenters here. Let me ask again a second thing on the scenarios. You had some of the scenarios that pointed to an increase in enrollment at the community colleges, and when we talk about these scenarios, we're talking about being somewhat flexible, right? But how long would you see that trend going? Is that a short-term trend, a long-term trend in terms of some of these enrollment patterns that you see in these scenarios?
I would envision, frankly, that would be a long-term trend, because I think that gets coupled with a reduction in the overall number of institutions. And I think that the institutions, we think that the institutions that would be most impacted negatively are your 4-year regional, largely tuition-dependent institutions, but I think also, frankly, or regional private institutions. But I think also your regional public institutions are probably going to be the ones that are, going to have the most, retraction, if you will, during this this period of sort of institutional, the number of institutions reducing. So I think that I do envision that community colleges are actually, in most of the scenarios, frankly, are probably going to over time grow enrollment. And you may see, unfortunately, a little bit more of a sort of stratification or a bifurcation of the strata where, you have many different sort of spheres of higher ed now, and you may find, however you want to draw that continuum, you may find a shift more towards the poles of the continuum. I don't know, Cole, we haven't really talked about that either. How do you feel about that?
Well, yeah, it's not backed up by any data whatsoever, so this may turn out to be a complete fallacy. But I've been wondering whether some of the initial drops in community college enrollment that we're seeing evidence of is not at least partially due to the fact that many of our regional and national 4 years are turning the dials significantly on acceptance in terms of loosening standards in order to fill classes. And I wonder if we've got some effect of individuals who could not get into a 4-year institution of their choosing are now seeing this as sort of a buyer's market and moving in that direction in the near term. That may not be a long-term trend. It may simply be that there's lower demand because individuals don't want to go to college if it's going to be an entirely remote experience or a severely restricted residential experience. And so the opportunity for those individuals to get in is greater, and they may be shifting their focus away from the 2-year institutions into the 4-year. It's a total hypothesis, but it's just something I've been thinking a little bit about.
Yeah, so if you were to give, we've got about 4 more minutes, if you were to give community colleges who are trying to balance, I mean, you've talked about these different scenarios, and you had the 10, you said, let's focus on those 10. If you were to pick one of those and just really say, what's the most important thing that you would suggest community colleges focus on as they try to plan for enrollment over the next 2 to 3 years, what would that be? I know you talked about commonalities, looking at the different scenarios, but what would your advice be?
Digitize.
Yeah, you go one.
You already said it, but I'm gonna double down on it. I digitize the student experience, right? It's and don't just think, as Cole referenced earlier, when the pandemic hit, most institutions said Zoom plus LMS, and that's what we're going to provide to students. I think it's about understanding that there will now presumably be a constant expectation from students that there will be some students who are exclusively, face-to-face. There are going to be some students that are exclusively online, but presumably students will seek some type of hybridized model for their education. And so thinking about digitization, not just as the curricular components of the education, but also the co-curricular and the extracurricular components of education, and understanding how you can make that as seamless as possible and make sure that a student who is attending college X feels as though they are attending college X, whether they're sitting in a classroom on college X's campus or they're at home on their computer, sort of like taking a course or engaging with their, with their fellow students or their faculty or whomever. I think it's really important to not just focus on the sort of digitization of the pedagogical component, but also all the other components that make an institution an institution.
And I guess I would say for those of you in the audience that are part of some kind of college system, whether that be at a municipal level or at a state level, to really double down on the systemness aspects of your system. And there's a paper we wrote a couple of years ago called The Futures, plural, of Public Higher Education. And in one of the 5 models in that paper, we talk about the notion of the sharing university and getting as much friction out of the system as possible for the sharing of academic programs, the sharing of administrative systems. This is the time to be doing that. I don't know if anyone in the audience is from the Dallas County Community College District, but I want to give a shout out to that system, who's now renamed themselves Dallas College, and it's the former 7 independently accredited 2-year institutions coming together as a 7-campus 4-year college system, and then using that moment, and this is a journey that they're still going down and will be for some time, but leveraging all the economies of scale that come with that creation of a single college with multiple campuses, harnessing the locality aspects of it, but also centralizing as much of the operations as possible so that you're focused on the delivery of high quality education at those 7 locations, as opposed to doing all this sort of administrative stuff and financial aid stuff 7 different ways. I think that's a real model to follow, and I would suggest looking at what Dr. Joe May has done in that. I'm sure there's plenty of other examples around the country, but that's one of the ones that stands out for me.
Well, we have reached the end of our time for the Meet the Expert session. Again, I want to thank both Scott and Cole for spending the time with us, both in the presentation and this Meet the Expert session. And I'd like to wish everybody a great afternoon.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.